Hi, Pastor Anthony Savaggio here, the Rochester Christian Reformed Church. Welcome to the Bible Bistro. This is episode 3, and in this series we're doing an introduction to the book of Lamentations, which I'll be preaching on later this summer, and this is to help you engage with that preaching. So just before I move on to the menu for today, I want to revisit the menu from the last episode in which we talked about the acrostic. And I think I could do a little bit more to help clarify some things around the acrostic. I was saying a lot of stuff there, and it's a little confusing. Let me try to just flesh that out for a couple of minutes here before we move on to today's main course. So just as a refresher, the acrostic is basically the idea that the verses in Lamentations, based on each chapter, each begin sequentially with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in order. So there's 22 letters, and so the first verse would begin with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the second verse, the second letter, the third verse, the third letter, and so on and so forth. That's the idea. I got the obviously English here, A, B, C, D, right? It would follow that type of pattern. Now, I mentioned, I just want to make sure this is clear, chapters 1 through 4 have that acrostic pattern. They have that acrostic pattern. It follows the Hebrew alphabet like that throughout. Now, chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5 have 22 verses perfectly. Okay, if you look in your Bibles, you'll see that to be the case. Chapter 3 has 66 verses, as I mentioned. So what that means is this chapter 3 has the acrostic pattern, but it triples in that. So we've got 3 times. And so what that means, it goes, I'm using obviously the English alphabet here, but it's in Hebrew in the original. A, the first 3 verses, B, 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 4, 5, 6, C, 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 7, 8, 9, D, and then would go to the similar pattern. So that's how complex that chapter is, maintaining that. That's very hard to do. It's very hard to start each verse with the letter, with the same, that same letter like that and tripling it, and that's what it does. That's a huge, that's a complex task from a literary perspective, but that's what happens. And then in chapter 5, as you note, it's not acrostic per se, but it maintains the 22 verses in that chapter, that structure according to the alphabet. So this kind of goes perhaps to the completeness of that. So not technically acrostic chapter 5, but still the 22 verses. So what all of that leads to is a very complex, well-structured, purposeful and poetic a piece of literature here in the book of Lamentations that through the Holy Spirit God inspired through this poet, through this narrator that we have. Now, you obviously recognize that when this comes into English, when the Hebrew is translated into English, if you look in your English Bibles, that acrostic pattern does not carry over into our English translations, and you can probably gather why. It's very complicated to do so and would lead perhaps to choice of words that don't necessarily accurately reflect the word in Hebrew. You can see it's complex enough to do it in Hebrew. To try to translate an acrostic pattern and preserve that into English is tremendously difficult, and translators have chosen not to do that. Now, in some ways, totally understandable. In some ways, really sad that we don't have the benefit of that in the English language, that acrostic pattern. Now, some people have undertaken that task, have tried to translate the book of Lamentations in English and maintaining an acrostic pattern like this. And I'll give you just a sample. The scholar is a man named Daniel Slavitt, Slavitt, and he tried to do this, to render a translation in English, maintaining an acrostic pattern using the English alphabet. And so here's what it sounds like. This will be chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. So you've got 10 verses here. A, B, 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 C, 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 then a D. And here's how it sounds. Afflicted am I and beset, a man whom God in his wrath has abased. Abused by his rod and broken, I am driven into darkness. Third one, against me he turned his hand, and again and again. Up here, bones broken, wasted, I am besieged and battered. Next one, bitterness is my portion and tribulation. Banished, I dwell in the darkest darkness like those long dead. Chained, so I cannot escape, and walled in I am captive. Crying for help, I call out, but he will not hear my prayer. Crooked are all my paths, which he has blocked with boulders. And then finally, desolate am I and desperate. So that's kind of a sampling of how you might render that. And you can see the power of that, right? The helpfulness and the impact. It's too bad we've lost that in the translations, but we understand why that was done to more accurately represent those words in the English language from the Hebrew. So that's just a little bit more on the acrostic pattern. Let's now transfer over to today's menu on the Bistro. Okay, so let's look at what's on the menu today at the Bistro. Today we're looking at the major and minor characters in the book of Lamentations. And perhaps you maybe never really gave thought to the fact that there are characters in this book, and there actually are a lot of them. There are a tremendous amount, and so that's something often people don't know about the book of Lamentations. So let's talk about those characters. Let's begin with the major characters in the book. And the major characters in the book include two. And the first one is the narrator. Now the narrator comes on the scene immediately. In chapter 1, verse 1, the book opens, "How lonely sits the city that was once full of people, how like a widow she has become. She that was great among the nations, she that was a princess among the provinces, has become a vassal." So right away we hear this voice of the narrator. It is a male voice. And the question about the book really is that voice, that male kind of narration voice, goes throughout the 5 chapters of the book. But there's some debate whether it's the same voice, the same person, the same narrator. Certainly there's broad agreement that the first 2 chapters are the same narrator, the same individual, the same voice. But there's some debate about whether chapters 3 through 5, whether there's a shift in the person speaking, in the narrator in those chapters. Some argue for continuity, some argue for a disconnect there in different voices. I tend to maybe lean towards the continuity side of that, perhaps just for the simplicity of preaching, the unity of that voice, maybe in a canonical sense. But anyhow, we have the narrator. That's really our main major character in this story, is the narrator who describes what has happened, who describes the scene. You can think of the narrator almost like a reporter in a major news network going in to observe something and reporting on what she sees in that situation. So the other major character is the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem. So the city itself becomes personified in the book of Lamentations, and I want you to think about that for a minute after I talk. I want to come back to that idea of the city being personified. We know what happened to the city, right? The event is the destruction of Jerusalem, 587 BC. The city is torn down, incinerated, burned, razed, the temple, all of that, right? This is devastation comes upon this city. And so the city of Jerusalem is a major character in the book. And that city is personified by a character that's referred to as daughter Zion, or daughter of Zion. If you listen here to chapter 1, verse 6, "From daughter Zion has departed all her majesty." So we have this personification. It is personified as a female, the city of Jerusalem. And for the most part, the voice of the city, it's more expressed in a passive way. What happened, describing it as daughter Zion, the city personified, but sometimes the city speaks. The daughter Zion speaks. And one of those instances where she interrupts to give her voice is in chapter 1, verse 9c. The C section of that verse is an ABC section. The end of that verse where she says, quote, "O Lord, look at my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed." So she speaks up. Her voice comes in and interrupts the narrator as she expresses her lament over what has happened. So Chris Wright in the commentary I am using here, a great book, Christopher J.H. Wright, The Message of Lamentations. It's source material here for what my series here I'm doing, and even today. He calls her Lady Zion throughout the commentary, Lady Zion. And she speaks up at times. But what happens is after chapter 2, she goes silent. We don't hear from her again. And the narrator really picks up the role and the voice of the city. This is one of the reasons for arguing for some type of discontinuity between chapters 1 and 2 and 3 through 5. So But it's important to recognize the power of personifying what happened to Jerusalem in this Lady Zion character, because it then makes it very personal, right? It makes it something that you can relate to, and it makes it very difficult. It's not something that happened to stone and brick and dust and buildings. It's something that happened to a person. And that makes the language more powerful. It makes what happened more painful, more real. The lament is more powerful by that personification. So it's a very effective device in expressing the lament and the suffering of Jerusalem to do that. So those are our major characters. We have our narrator. We have the city of Jerusalem personified as Lady Zion. Our minor characters, and there's a huge cast, right? Here's a huge cast of minor characters. Maybe that's something you haven't reflected on a ton, but there are minor characters. One of those minor characters are the lovers and friends of Lady Zion. That is those who, and really this is about betrayal. I thought you were my friend, I thought you were my lover, but in the moment of my trouble, you betrayed me, you turned your back on me. That's kind of the focus of these characters. The passers-by are another characters, those who just watched. Some of them watched and mocked. Some of them just watched and did nothing. But they are a character in the story not very attractively portrayed. Chapter 1, verse 12, "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger." So these passerbys are called to account, those who looked on and watched the suffering of Jerusalem and did nothing. Then there are the princes, the priests, the prophets, and we can add the elders here, the religious leaders and the political leaders. They're also characters here, mostly portrayed as having failed. Failed the city, failed the people, either through iniquity, through neglect. They are characters in this story. Even elders are part of that. We hear at one point, chapter 2, verse 10, "The elders of daughter Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth." So these are characters as well in our story. We also have soldiers, and this is primarily those who lost their lives in defense of Jerusalem, their lives being trampled on. They also appear in our story. And then this triad of young women, mothers, and children. Young women, mothers, and children, who are particularly the victims of suffering. And particularly, remember, we are in an ancient world, and this group is among the most vulnerable in that world at that time. And they really experience the brunt of the suffering, and it's expressed there. A lot of this is hard to read, I'll be honest with you. There are sensitivities in our world that were not present then, and the way this is described in the terms of suffering, in terms of assault, is very disturbing to us. But it also very powerful lament of expressing what has happened. And many people, even feminist scholars, have found a voice here in the book of Lamentations for the voice of women, the voice of suffering. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But that is a powerful thing. At the end of verse 10 of chapter 2, there's this line: "The young girls of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground." Right. This is the loss, the suffering, what has happened, the shame of what has happened in a shame culture. So we have a lot of characters. A lot of minor characters, a big cast of characters, and narrators going through all of this, describing what's going on. Like I said, like a reporter, here's what's happening, here's what the elders are doing, here's what the women are doing, the mothers, the children, passers-by, and you get this really powerful image of suffering that we get to hear that voice of the city itself that has suffered so much. And that's how the story is told, through these characters. Now, although there are many characters, there's one missing character. And maybe you've already come to that conclusion. I have it here. It's hard to see here in the green, but there's a missing character in this story. And that character is God. God does not speak in this book. So there is an interesting thing. Now, let me kind of summarize all of this. Chris Wright, in that commentary I mentioned, he first of all talks about the whole kind of compilation of these characters and the power of that. This is what he says. Lamentations is like a great living canvas in which our eyes are drawn to one character or group after another at every level of society in their voiced or voiceless suffering, till the whole scene is as densely packed with people as the poetry is with words. So what the book of Lamentations is a mosaic of words, of poetry, but also of people. A whole lot of them. And whether they speak or don't speak, they come together and they help to make this mosaic, this composite picture of suffering in a very powerful way. But going to this missing character, Wright writes this: there is one voice we never hear. So we've got a lot of characters, but one voice we never hear. God does not speak in the whole book of Lamentations. That is an interesting thing. What does that mean? Does God not care? He goes on, heaven is silent, which does not necessarily mean that heaven is deaf or blind. We shall consider later what Kathleen O'Connor calls the power of the missing voice. Kathleen O'Connor wrote a book on Lamentations, a book that I have, and I'll be sharing it with you. And she talks about the power of the missing voice. Now, I want you to hold on to that. I want you to hold on to that idea, because that's crucial to understanding this book and understanding God's silence. What does she mean by the power of the missing voice? We will find out. But so far, we've seen our cast of characters, this whole composite, this whole mosaic that's put together, how this story is told, what the missing character is God. He is silent. What does that mean? The power of the missing voice. We will find out. But thank you for tuning in to the Bistro today and sampling from the menu. I hope it helps you to get ready and to be ready to engage this book of Lamentations, this very important memorial that we want to respect, engage with, and that has something to say to us today. It is a book for today. God bless you all, and thanks for tuning in.